Hi guys, today we're going to talk about finding percents, and we're really going to break this lesson into two parts. We're going to talk about finding percents using proportions, which is pretty similar to what very similar exactly, what we've been doing when we find our percents in this unit on our tests and quizzes. So the I can statement we're working on is I can use proportional relationships to solve multi-step ratio and percent problems. And we're really going to focus on the percent problems portion of this for this lesson. After we talk about using proportions to find percents, we're going to talk about using equations to find percents. And you may find as we're going through the proportions section of this lesson that there's going to be an equation that's very similar that's going to pop up every single time we solve a proportions problem. So let's consider the following statement. 8 is 50% of 16. Now we all know that 8 is 50% of 16, but let's look at that visually and what this statement is really telling us. What it's saying is if I had 16 of something, 16 circles, and I wanted to find 50% of that, well, we know 50% is equivalent to half, so half of 16. Remember when we were talking about fractions, and we said that word of means to multiply. That's going to be important later on when we get into writing an equation. But for now, of 16, 16 tells us that's the total. Okay, so out of 16, 50%, which I know as 50% as a fraction is 1/2, is 8. Because when I take half of 16, I get 8, or half times 16, I get 8. So I can write a proportion. 8 over 16, because 8 is the part that I'm using, out of 16, which is the whole, equals 50%. And we know all percents, we talked about this earlier this year, percents are always out of 100. So 50% of 100. So 100 will represent our whole for the percent. Now let's go back to that statement. And I can see that both of these equal half, so I have equivalent ratios. But when we're working with percent statements, we can always find this proportion useful. Is, 8 is, over of 16 equals the percent over 100. And the 100 is never going to change because percent is always represented as a number out of 100. So 8 is, I can put this 8, since it comes with the is, and I know 8 is, goes in my proportion where I put that 8. Of 16, so I put that 16 where the of is in my proportion. 50%, the percent goes where I put the percent symbol in my basic standard proportion, okay, of 100. And I can tell again that they're equivalent ratios. So let's look at a problem that's missing a piece. This one says, what percent of 24 is 6? And let's look down at this basic proportion I have here. Is over of, or part over whole, equals percent, which is the part of 100%. So percent over 100. So what percent of 24 is 6? When I'm looking at this statement, I might notice that I can fill in the is. Is 6. This is telling me that the is, or the part, is 6. Part of what? Of 24. So the part that 6 represents comes from the whole of 24. And I don't know the percent. It's not given in this problem. So I'm going to substitute a variable so I can figure out what percent of 24 is 6. Now once I've set up my proportion, I simply need to solve this proportion by, and there's many ways. In this case, I'm going to choose to use cross products because I don't know what I multiply 24 by to get 100 easily in my head. So I cross multiply. 6 times 100 needs to equal 24 times x. And as we talked about in the previous unit, cross products in a proportion must be equal in order for it to be a proportion. So if I know I'm going to find what x is, I have to cross multiply, and that has to be equal to each other. So now I just have an equation. 6 times 100 gives me 600 and equals 24x. I divide by 24 to get 25 equals x. So my answer is 25%. Let's look at another one. 40% of what number is 16? When I'm looking at this, the first thing that might jump out at me is that 40%. And it's very easy to find the percent because it's got the percent symbol with it in a percent question. And so I just plug that in where the percent goes in my standard proportion here. So now I need to decide, do I have the is or the of or both? And I'm reading this, I might say, of what number I see is 16. That jumps out at me. I know that whatever the percent is, 40%, is 16. They're the same. So they have to go in the same part in my proportion. And in this case, the percent goes on top. So the part that represents that 40%, which is 16, goes on the top as well of the other ratio. So looking through this, I notice that I am missing the of. I don't know what 16 represents the 40% of what number. I don't know what the whole is. So I put an x there. And again, I'm going to solve this using cross products because I don't know what number I need to multiply by 16 to get to 40 or divide 40 by to get to 16. So I cross multiply. I'll get 16 times 100 equals 40x, or x times 40. And then I go ahead, I simplify 16 times 100, and then I'm going to solve by dividing by 40 to get x equals 40. So 40% of what number is 16? 40% of 40 is 16. Let's look at one more example. In this one, I have to figure out what I'm missing. Right away I notice I've got that percent there. 35% of 16 is what number? Well, what jumps out at me right away is that 35% because it's got that symbol which tells me exactly where to put it in my proportion. The tricky part is figuring out what's the is or what's the of. So 35%, do I know what that 35% represents in this problem? I don't. But I do know that that 35, whatever that number is, it's out of 16. So 16 is my of, and the is, I don't know what it is. So I need to put an x in there for the is. And again, I don't know what I multiply 16 by to get 100 in my head, and I don't know what to divide 100 by to get to 16, so I'm going to solve using cross products. And when I cross multiply, 16 times 35 has to equal x times 100. And I get 16 times 35 is 560 equals 100x. So I divide by 100 to find out what x is, and it's 5 6/10. So 35% of 16 is 5 6/10. Now it's your turn. Solve these three problems. Press pause, go back and watch any portion of the video you need help with, and when you're done, press play because we're going to talk about equations. Okay, let's talk about the percent equation, and you may have noticed some similarities as we are solving these percent problems in the proportion. Each one gave us an equation at the end. So what we're going to talk about today is the rest of this lesson is I can solve percent problems. And in this case, we're going to use an equation to do that. Questions don't change from when we're solving them with proportions. What percent of 80 is 25? I don't know the percent, but I can plug it into the proportion. Of is my 80, is 25, the percent is missing, so I cross multiply. 25 times 100, 8 times x, and then, or 80 times x, sorry, and then I go ahead and divide to find 31 and 25/100%. But let's solve this problem using an equation, and let's see what we've got. So we noticed in the previous problem, I ended up really having a division problem, or a one-step multiplication equation where I had to solve using division. But let's look at this equation that I've written here. The percent, which I don't know, can be multiplied by 80 because this word of, remember we talked earlier that of can also mean percent? Well, let's use that as, of can mean multiply. Let's use that as multiply. So what percent, some percent, of multiplying 80 is 25. So 80 gets multiplied by the percent, is means equals, and 25 is what I should get when I finish this equation. To solve this, I divide by 80, and I'm going to get, in this problem, a decimal, and you can use calculators. How do I turn a decimal to a percent? Well, remember, when we turn a decimal to a percent, we can think of Dr. Pepper method. Decimal to percent, I move the decimal to the right 2 places, and I would get 31 and 25/100%. Let's look at another problem. What number is 30% of 85? 65. So here I've got my multiplication problem, 30% of 65. But in order to do this problem, I do need to turn that percent back into a decimal. So let's look at what it's going to look like. I don't know what number I get, but I know it is, and a lot of times we think of is as equals, 30% turned into a decimal. Of means times, of what? Of 65. So I'm multiplying here. And in this problem, all I need to do is multiply 30 times 65 to get my x, which is 19 and 5/10. And that is what my answer is, right there. That is 19 and 5/10 is 30% of 65. And you can check it using a proportion if you don't believe me. Let's look at another one. One more problem. 40% of what number is 34? Let's look at what we have. I have 40%, but I need to turn that, using Dr. Pepper, from a percent to a decimal, which means I need to take that decimal and move it to the right, and I always move it twice because 100 has 2 zeros. So that gives me 4/10 of, means to multiply. What number? I don't know. Is, means equals, 34. Now I've got a one-step multiplication problem, so I need to divide both sides by 4/10 to get x equals 85. So 40% of 85 is 34. Let's do some more practice. Solve these 3 problems in the work section of your WSQ. When we are done, we are done with this lesson. So you can go back and watch any portion as many times as you need to. You may use a calculator, but I do need to see your equations written out. Okay? So write out the equation that you would use to solve each of these problems in the work section of your WSQ. Show your steps, but you can use a calculator to do any calculations. Don't forget to write a complete summary, and any questions you have or someone else in the class might have in the Q section of your WSQ. Or you can write an extension question that might make other people in the class think more deeply on this subject.